Have you ever felt like there's, a whole universe happening inside you, just sort of beneath the surface of your everyday thoughts and feelings?
Uh-huh, like hidden currents.
Exactly. Like there are these hidden forces, maybe patterns, shaping who you are, how you react, how you connect with everything around you.
Yeah.
Well, that deep mystery, that inner world, and how it undeniably impacts our outer lives. That's exactly where we're plunging in today.
Sounds good.
We're doing a deep dive into the really groundbreaking ideas of Carl Jung. He was a Swiss psychiatrist who, well, he really dared to explore the depths of the human psyche, way beyond what most people were thinking about at the time.
He certainly ruffled some feathers.
He did. So our mission today is to unpack his key concepts, things like the layers of the unconscious, these universal patterns that influence us all.
The archetypes, yeah.
Exactly. And we want to see how these powerful ideas still resonate, like right now in modern life, and also understand the unique therapy that came out of his work.
And how it's maybe changed over time, too.
Right, how Jungian practice is evolving.
Okay, and to guide us through this, it's pretty complex stuff.
It is.
We've drawn from a really rich collection of sources. These are insights from, experienced Jungian analysts, scholars, people whose writings build on Jung's original work. They offer different perspectives, different angles on his theories and how they apply today.
So we've got some good guides.
Think of them like experience guides, yeah, giving us the map and compass for this journey into the psyche.
Okay, let's start with that map then, Jung's map of the psyche. Because his view was, well, it was pretty revolutionary, wasn't it? It went way beyond just seeing the mind as our conscious thoughts or even just our personal baggage.
Absolutely, that's a key point.
Yeah.
Jung didn't see the psyche as limited just to our conscious ego, that I or sense of self we walk around with every day.
Right.
He saw it as much, much vaster, a layered realm. And the conscious part, just a tiny fraction of the whole thing.
Okay, but the ego is there, and it's important. It's our center of consciousness, the bit that feels like me, right? The part making decisions, dealing with the outside world.
Definitely vital.
The sources mention it arises from, what was it, the collision between the somatic factor and the environment early on.
That interaction.
So through that interaction, we get this sense of being a subject, separate from objects, inner from outer. It's kind of our anchor.
It's our anchor in reality, exactly. But, and this is the big but, the unconscious, in Jung's view, isn't just a dumping ground for forgotten memories or things we've repressed.
Although that's part of it, the personal stuff.
That's part of it, yeah. He called that the personal unconscious. But beneath that, or maybe surrounding it, is this enormous territory, this vast realm he called the collective unconscious.
Okay.
And that is constantly influencing our conscious lives, shaping our perceptions, our emotions, our behaviors, often completely without us realizing it, like the huge hidden part of the iceberg.
And this collective unconscious idea, that's where Jung really diverged from some other thinkers, like Freud, right? It's not just personal.
Precisely. That's the radical step. The collective unconscious is seen as an inherited, universal layer of the psyche, shared by all humans.
Inherited, so like we're born with it.
That's the idea.
Yep.
It's not formed by our individual experiences after birth. It's more like a psychic inheritance passed down through generations. The sources describe it as containing these pre-existent forms or patterns that kind of organize how we experience the world.
Like a deep structure, a blueprint common to all of humanity, regardless of culture or time.
Yes, exactly that. A common psychic foundation. And within this collective unconscious, that's where we find the archetypes.
Ah, yes. The archetypes, probably one of Jung's most famous concepts. People have definitely heard of those.
They are very well known, and they are basically the fundamental building blocks, these core patterns within that collective unconscious.
So what are they exactly? Are they just images, like characters?
Well, not quite just static images. The sources describe them as really dynamic, potent forces. One definition calls them systems of readiness for action, and at the same time, images and emotions.
Okay, systems of readiness for action. That sounds important.
It is. That definition really highlights that archetypes aren't just mental ideas. They're seen as connecting mind and body. They influence our instincts, our gut reactions, our emotions, just as much as our thoughts or the images that pop into our heads. They're like potentials. Potentials that get activated by our life experiences.
So there are these underlying patterns of how we might experience things or behave, and then life events trigger them. But we experience them as images or themes.
Yes, we perceive them indirectly through how they manifest.
Yeah.
Jung saw them showing up everywhere, universally, in myths, legends, fairy tales, religious symbols, dreams. across totally different cultures.
And today,
And crucially for today, yeah, we see them playing out constantly in our modern stories. Films, books, TV shows, even Jung uses this great analogy, it's mentioned in the sources, like how ancient peoples looked up at the random scattering of stars and projected meaningful images onto them. They saw constellations, right? The Great Bear, Orion.
giving order to the chaos.
Exactly. It's a similar process with archetypes. There are these inherent patterns within the psyche that we project onto the world and onto our inner experience. It gives form and meaning to what might otherwise just feel like random, chaotic psychic stuff.
That analogy really helps. We keep seeing these universal themes, these character types, these situations again and again because they tap into something really deep and shared in all of us.
Precisely.
Okay, let's make this more concrete. Let's look at some specific examples from the sources. The hero archetype, that's got to be the most recognizable one, right?
The hero is definitely front and center. The sources, people like Caro Tenuto, Boyd, Iacchino, they all link it fundamentally to a journey, a quest. Yeah. Specifically, a journey to conquer or recover some kind of treasure. And that treasure often symbolizes something like a higher value or maybe a new level of awareness of consciousness.
And it's never easy.
Never easy. The journey always involves confronting powerful, often scary aspects of the unconscious. These might be personified as, say, difficult parental figures or maybe facing some huge obstacle, external or internal, like a fiery dragon.
Oh, fiery dragon. I like that. Sounds suitably epic. The sources mention an example from Battle for the Planet of the Apes.
Yes, exactly, where the ape leader, Caesar, has to descend into this dangerous underground world. It's guarded by these mutated human remnants who hold the key to past knowledge, these tapes.
Right.
That descent into a dangerous, often underground place, facing a powerful guardian who holds something precious. That's a classic hero pattern. Confronting the fiery dragon, the mutants, and the danger to get the treasure, which here is symbolized by the tapes, the wisdom of the past. It's about overcoming fear and obstacles to gain something vital.
Makes sense. Okay, what's another big one? The Great Mother archetype is mentioned.
Ah, the Great Mother. Now, this one really shows the duality, the two-sided nature inherent in these archetypes.
Duality, meaning good and bad.
Essentially, yes. As Boyd and Bertin point out, it has two fundamental poles. On the one hand, it's the archetype of nurturing, life-giving, fostering growth, security, warmth. That's the positive, loving aspect.
The good mother.
The good mother, exactly.
Yeah.
But the sources also talk about its other potential, being binding, devouring, overwhelming, even destructive or blighting.
Wow. So it can be incredibly creative or incredibly destructive.
Precisely. Think about the power of the mother image. It can elevate a young woman having her first baby, right? It gives this archetypal power to her new role, makes her feel this intense devotion. That's the positive side. But, as Bertin points out, if nothing changes psychologically within her, if she gets stuck relating to this powerful archetype in just a narrow personal way, she might cling to the child too much, trying to keep experiencing that initial satisfaction forever. And that binds the child, it blights their growth.
So the archetype itself isn't good or bad, it's how we relate to it.
It's very much about the individual's conscious relationship to it. The sources say these powerful family archetypes infuse ordinary life with this uncanny power, making it feel radiant or dark, depending on how we integrate them.
And the father archetype, also dual, but maybe in a different way.
Yes, the father archetype, discussed by Boyd and Jacobi, is fundamentally linked to things like authority, structure, rules, logic, the external world, logos.
Okay.
But it also carries the potential for power struggles, for rigid control, domination, and deep issues around trust or mistrust.
Ah, trust issues.
Jacobi gives this really compelling example from infant research about early development. If a father can't tolerate his young son's natural attempts at asserting himself, his bids for independence, if it leads to constant power struggles, that can create a negative father complex. And it's not just a childhood spat. It can imprint really deeply, leading to the adult son being fundamentally unable to trust the father. He sees everything the father does through this negative filter.
Yeah.
He's on those old feelings and projections.
Wow. That really shows how these early dynamics, when they activate these powerful archetypes, can just shape our whole perception of relationships later on.
Absolutely. They can really distort things.
Okay, then there's the shadow, another famous one.
The shadow, yes, another universal archetype. It basically represents all those disowned or darker aspects of our personality.
The parts we don't like.
The parts we don't like or the parts we don't even know about ourselves. The things we consciously or unconsciously reject. Traits, impulses, feelings that just don't fit with our self-image, our ego ideal.
And in stories, it's often the villain.
Often the adversary, yeah, or the difficult obstacle the hero has to confront, or it shows up in antagonist characters.
The sources, like Iachino's work on cinema, bring this into modern stuff too, mentioning the divided superhero, like Batman or Superman.
Yes, those analyses are fascinating. Figures like Batman, operating in the shadows, outside the law. His vigilantism itself is kind of shadowy.
Right.
Or even Superman, who has to separate his potentially dangerous, all-powerful alien side of his shadow in a way from his mild-mannered human persona, Clark Kent. They both show this struggle with a fragmented self or the need to confront a darker, powerful part of oneself.
And Batman's villains.
Exactly. Iachino points out how Batman's villains, Penguin, Catwoman, often share his troubled nature. They kind of embody the aspects he's wrestling with internally and externally. They are manifestations of his own shadow.
That connection between the hero and villain reflecting different sides of the same coin, that's a powerful idea. What about the Anima and Animus? These sound a bit more complex.
They are fascinating and absolutely crucial in Jungian thought. They represent the contrasexual personifications of the unconscious within us.
Contrasexual.
Meaning the anima is the unconscious feminine principle or inner figure in a man, and the animus is the unconscious masculine principle or inner figure in a woman. Von Franz, Papadopoulos, Bertin, they all discuss these quite a bit.
Okay. And what do?
Well, they can act as bridges to the deeper layers of the unconscious. They can be sources of creativity, inspiration, vitality. But if they're not integrated, not understood, they can become real obstacles, especially in relationships.
And they show up differently in men and women.
Yes, they tend to manifest differently. In a man, the anima often expresses itself through things like shifting moods, sudden intense emotions, vague romantic fantasies, irrational impulses, things that seem to come out of nowhere. It can be the muse, but also the source of moody unpredictability.
Okay. And in women?
In a woman, the animus tends to appear more as unconscious impulses towards action, maybe sudden initiatives, or sometimes as rather rigid, dogmatic opinions and convictions that can seem quite impersonal or overly rational, like unshakable assumptions.
And the sources specifically link these projections onto partners as a major cause of relationship conflict, the war of the sexes.
Absolutely. This is a really profound insight from Jung, echoed in the sources. He argued that these powerful inner figures, the anima in men, the animus in women, used to be contained, in a way, within religious figures.
How so?
Think about traditional religious imagery. Christ as the heavenly bridegroom, embodying a kind of idealized masculine principle, or Mary, or Sophia, or even the church itself, embodying aspects of the divine feminine, the anima figure. These archetypes were projected onto these transcendent symbols.
Okay, I see.
But, Jung argued, with the decline of the power of traditional religious frameworks in the modern West, these archetypal energies and images, they don't just disappear, they get projected, largely unconsciously, onto human partners.
Whoa. So instead of relating to some divine ideal, we're unconsciously demanding that our actual human husband or wife embody these huge archetypal forces.
Precisely. And according to Jung, this makes modern relationships, especially romantic ones, psychologically huge. They carry this enormous weight of unconscious expectation.
Which sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Well, it makes them much more difficult, much more complex, much more prone to conflict. Because let's face it, no actual human being can possibly live up to the unconscious demands of an archetype.
Right.
But, and here's the potential upside, this very difficulty forces us to confront our own unconscious psyche. It pushes us towards withdrawing those projections and integrating these inner figures within ourselves, rather than constantly demanding it from others. It's a key insight into why modern relationships feel both so vital and so challenging.
That really puts a lot of relationship struggles into a different light. Okay, one more major archetype. The self.
The self. In many ways, this is the most important archetype in Jung's system, and also the most encompassing. It's the central archetype of wholeness.
Wholeness.
It represents the totality of the psyche. It encompasses and unites both the conscious and the unconscious. The ego and all those deeper layers, it's not the ego is just the center of consciousness. The self is more like a transcendent, organizing principle that holds all the opposites together.
So it's like the ultimate goal, the guiding principle towards integration.
It is. The self is often symbolized by images that represent totality or the union of opposites. Think of figures like the wise old man or the wise old woman. Those often represent aspects of the self. Or the Great Mother we discussed, or mandalas.
Mandalas, the circular drawings.
Yes, those circular or sometimes square images found across cultures. They symbolize the center, Totality, psychic order, meaning, as Anne Franz put it, the self is the greater, the eternal human being in us. It's this potential for wholeness that exists from the start, but it needs to be consciously realized.
So it represents our full potential, who we are meant to become, the integration of everything conscious, unconscious archetypes into a complete whole individual.
That's the idea, a very profound concept.
Okay, moving beyond archetypes now. Jung also talked a lot about complexes.
Yes, complexes are another core concept, and Jung actually discovered these very early on through his experimental work.
Right, the sources mentioned his work with the word association test and some kind of skin response measurement.
Exactly, the psychogalvanic reflex. These experiments were really pivotal. Jung would give people a list of stimulus words and ask them to say the first word that came to mind.
Okay.
And he noticed that for certain words, their reaction time would suddenly get much longer, or they might stutter, or blush, or make a mistake, or just block completely. And the physiological measures, like skin conductance, would spike around those specific words.
So it wasn't just that the word was hard to think of.
No, he realized it wasn't about intellectual difficulty, it was about emotional loading. The stimulus word had touched upon a sensitive, emotionally charged area in the person's unconscious, a complex.
So a complex is like a cluster of ideas and feelings all stuck together with strong emotion.
That's a good way to put it. It's like an emotionally charged constellation of ideas, images, memories, all orbiting around a central archetypal core, often in the unconscious. It's like a little splinter in the psyche, acting almost autonomously.
Autonomously, like it has a life of its own.
In a way, yes. It's charged with affect, with emotion, and it can really interfere with our conscious intentions. As Jacobi and Papadopoulos note, complexes can powerfully distort our perception, our thinking, our behavior.
Like that negative father complex example.
Exactly. The emotional charge around those past interactions makes it impossible for the son to see the father's current actions neutrally. The complex filters reality through its own emotional pattern. It literally hijacks objective perception.
They sound like these powerful internal forces that can really pull us off course.
They absolutely can be, and understanding and working with them is central to Jungian therapy.
Okay. And beyond these structures, Jung also developed his famous typology, right? Psychological functions and attitudes.
Yes, his model of consciousness types. He described 4 main functions we use to orient ourselves: thinking logic, analysis, truth, feeling values, relatedness, subjective experience, intuition possibilities, hunches, future potential, and sensation, concrete reality, facts, the 5 senses.
Thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition.
Right, and these operate through 2 basic attitudes: extroversion orientation, primarily towards the outer world of people and things, and introversion orientation, primarily towards the inner world of ideas and subjective experience.
We don't need to get into the whole Myers-Briggs thing here.
No. But the sources touch upon an important point related to this. As Cambray notes, our least developed function, our inferior function.
The one we're not good at.
The one we're least comfortable with, yeah. It often operates unconsciously in a really crude, black and white compensatory way, especially earlier in life. Before we do the work of differentiating it, bringing it more into consciousness, integrating it.
So part of development is learning to use all the functions better.
Exactly. It highlights Jung's focus on developing the whole personality, not just leaning on our dominant strengths and ignoring the rest.
Okay, so the psyche has all these structures: ego, personal unconscious, collective unconscious, archetypes, complexes, and these ways of functioning. Jung saw psychological development, especially in the second half of life, as this profound journey involving all these elements. Which brings us to individuation.
Individuation. Yes, this is perhaps the central concept in Jung's whole psychology, and it's the primary goal of Jungian analysis.
So what is it exactly?
It's the lifelong process of psychological development, moving towards becoming a distinct, individual, integrated whole person. It involves differentiating yourself from the sort of collective norms and expectations, both the pressures of society and the undifferentiated pull of the collective unconscious.
So it's about becoming uniquely yourself, integrating your personal history, but also your connection to those deeper universal patterns.
Yes. Papadopoulos and Jacobi describe it as the gradual development of consciousness out of that original state where we're unconsciously identified with the collective, expanding our conscious life, embracing our unique potential. And fundamentally, it's the process of bringing that latent self, that archetype of wholeness we talked about, into conscious reality. allowing its organizing principle to guide the personality.
Now, this isn't about becoming isolated, is it? Like some kind of radical individualist cut off from everyone.
Crucially, no. That's a common misunderstanding. It's not about separation in that sense. It's about integrating all the different parts of oneself, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective, light and shadow, into a more cohesive, functioning whole.
Integration, not separation.
Right. And a huge part of individuation involves the confrontation and integration of opposites within the psyche,
Opposites. Like what?
like conscious versus unconscious, masculine versus feminine principles,
Yeah.
thinking versus feeling, intuition versus sensation, even significantly good versus evil.
And the idea isn't to get rid of one side of the pair, like become purely rational or purely emotional.
Exactly not. As Carrot discusses, individuation involves bringing these opposites into dialogue, finding what Jung called a transcendent function that can unite them, hold the tension between them.
Okay.
Carrot mentions the idea of psychological androgyny, which again isn't about physical sex. It's about bringing those typically masculine modalities, maybe drive, structure, exploration, and feminine modalities perhaps, connection, relatedness, receptivity closer together within the individual psyche so they can work together creatively, not be at war.
Integrating the masculine and feminine within. And Jung had a really specific, maybe controversial view on integrating good and evil too, didn't he? Within the self.
He did, and it was a hugely significant part of his later work. He explored it intensely in his book Answer to Job, which von Franz also discusses. Jung contrasted the traditional Christian God image, often seen as representing only pure goodness,
Right. All good, no bad.
with his understanding of the self, which, as the archetype of totality, must by definition unite all aspects of the psyche, including the light and the shadow, good and evil.
Okay. So what's the implication of that?
The profound implication is this. If the archetype of wholeness itself, the self, includes the potential for darkness or evil, then for us human beings to move towards our own wholeness, we must also find a way to acknowledge and integrate our own capacity for darkness, our own shadow.
Wow.
Jung felt really strongly about this. He believed that suppressing the shadow side, denying our human capacity for evil as well as good, leads to immense psychological problems, and societal ones too. He saw contributing to the horrors of the 20th century, projecting our darkness onto others.
So ignoring our own darkness makes it more dangerous.
Precisely. He believed that for wholeness to be real, for the divine to become truly incarnate in actual people, it had to involve confronting and incorporating the shadow, just like we humans must. So individuation requires a conscious wrestling with your own shadow, confronting your own capacity for evil, not just trying to be purely good.
That's a challenging idea, but powerful. Wholeness means embracing the full spectrum, warts and all.
It does. And that means individuation requires consciously facing these difficult, often really uncomfortable contents of the unconscious.
You can't just ignore them.
Absolutely not.
Oh,
As Jacobi points out, it necessitates the ego, our conscious self, confronting the stuff that bubbles up from the unconscious, whether that's through dreams or active imagination or symptoms or difficult relationship dynamics. It's not a passive drift. It takes courage and sustained effort to engage with these inner realities.
and ultimately this whole journey of becoming whole, it's linked to bringing something unique into the world.
Yes, more touches on this, but it's a broader Jungian idea.
Yeah.
Individuation is connected to the concept that each person has a unique gift, a unique contribution that only they can bring to the world, but they can only offer it fully by becoming their integrated self. It's seen as a kind of final worthy task, finding and offering your unique piece.
That gives the whole personal journey a kind of collective meaning too. It's
Yeah.
not just for you. Okay, so if individuation is this path towards wholeness, how does Jungian therapy actually help people walk that path? What does it do?
Right. Jungian therapy, or analytical psychology as it's formally known, is fundamentally geared towards facilitating this very process of individuation.
That's its main goal.
That's the primary aim, yes, as described by Jacobi, Papadopoulos, Stein, and others. It's about helping the individual integrate unconscious material into consciousness, moving towards greater psychological wholeness, towards realizing the self.
So it's not just about fixing symptoms like anxiety or depression and getting you back to normal.
While symptom relief can definitely be a result, and an important one, the deeper goal is really process-oriented. It's about fostering long-term psychological growth, the integration of the whole personality. It's more of a journey of discovery and transformation than just a repair job.
Okay. And how do they do that? What are the key methods? Dream analysis must be a big one.
Dream analysis is probably the most well-known, yes. And as we hinted at, Jung had a pretty different take on dreams compared to, say, Freud.
Right. Not just disguised wishes.
No. Jung saw dreams not as things deliberately disguised or purely wish fulfillments needing decoding based only on personal history. He saw them more as pure nature, a spontaneous product of the psyche.
Pure nature.
Yeah. Offering direct, though symbolic, insights into the unconscious. And crucially, often providing a kind of self-regulatory compensation to our conscious attitude.
Compensation. Meaning?
Meaning, if our conscious view of things gets too one-sided, too rigid, or ignores something important, the dream often presents a balancing image or perspective from the unconscious. It tries to bring things back into equilibrium.
So dreams are showing us what our conscious mind is missing or needs to pay attention to.
Precisely. The sources, especially von Franz, really emphasize this. She argued that the difficulty in understanding dreams isn't because they're trying to hide something, but because our logical, focused ego consciousness just struggles with the symbolic, nonlinear language of the unconscious.
It speaks a different language.
It does. And dreams, in Jung's view, can actually help build what Carotenuto calls self-immunizing and self-repairing structures within the psyche. They offer a natural way for the personality to maintain balance and health. They show us, as von Franz said, a bit of spirit that isn't yet our own, giving us a glimpse into that creative source we came from.
That's a really powerful way to look at dreams. Not just reflections of problems, but actually part of the healing process itself. Okay, what else? Amplification. That sounds technical.
Amplification is a key Jungian technique. It's used especially when working with dreams or other unconscious material, like images from imagination. It's about going beyond just the individual's personal associations to an image or symbol.
Beyond the personal, how?
By bringing in cultural, mythological, religious, historical, and archetypal parallels and analogies, you try to understand the symbol not just in the context of the individual's life, but in the context of universal human experience.
So if someone dreams of a snake, you wouldn't just ask, what do snakes mean to you? You'd also look at...
You'd start there, definitely. The personal association is always the first step. What does this snake in this dream mean to you? But if that feels limited or doesn't quite capture the energy of the image, then you amplify. You explore the snake as an archetypal symbol across cultures. What does this snake represent in mythology, in religion, in folklore?
Healing, transformation, wisdom, danger, the underworld, all that stuff.
All that stuff, yeah. But the goal isn't to just slap a label on it like, oh, snake means transformation. It's about expanding the possible field of meaning around the image. As Cambry and Papadopoulos describe it, it's a constructive approach. It looks for the underlying purpose or goal of the psychic content, seeing it as meaningful in itself, rather than just reducing it to past clauses or personal history. It brings together both the subjective, personal meaning and the objective, collective, archetypal meaning.
It's like seeing your own personal drama playing out on this much larger universal stage. Makes sense. What about active imagination? That sounds active.
It is active. Active imagination is a core Jungian method for engaging directly and consciously with unconscious contents, not just analyzing them after the fact, like a dream you remember.
How do you do that?
You consciously interact with the images, the figures, the effects, the impulses that arise from the unconscious. It's not just passive daydreaming or letting your mind wander. It's an active dialogue or interaction with your inner world. You allow the unconscious material to unfold somewhat autonomously, but you maintain a conscious, engaged standpoint. You relate to it.
Okay. But how do you even start something like that? Where does the material come from?
Papadopoulos notes that the starting points are often found right in our emotional disturbances. Things like persistent depression, anxiety, intense anger, obsessive thoughts, even a recurring fantasy or a particularly vivid dream image.
So you use the emotional energy.
Exactly. The intensity of the feeling holds the energy you need to begin the engagement. You might focus on a dream image that stays with you, or a strong emotion, or a fantasy figure, and then you consciously allow it to develop. You let it move, speak, interact with you, as if it were real. You might write it down as a dialogue, or paint it, or sculpt it, or even move it with your body.
So you're giving form and voice to the unconscious, letting it communicate directly with your conscious mind.
Yes, and learning to relate to it not just as a symptom or a problem to be fixed, but as a source of potential wisdom, energy, and transformation. It's about bringing conscious and unconscious together into a kind of co-creation.
Fascinating. Are there other techniques mentioned?
The sources also mention things like Sandplay, using a sandbox and miniature figures to create scenes. It's especially useful with children or for accessing nonverbal layers of the psyche in adults. It bypasses the need for purely verbal expression.
Okay. And underlying all these methods, the relationship between the analyst and the person in therapy must be incredibly important.
It's absolutely crucial. It's often described as the container or the crucible where the real work happens. The sources, especially Papadopoulos and Jacobi, really stress that Jungian therapy is not just a technical procedure. It's not like a doctor diagnosing an illness and prescribing a cure to a passive patient.
It's more relational.
Deeply relational. The interaction, the connection, the dynamic between the therapist and the patient is utterly central to the process of healing and transformation.
So it's a very human encounter at its core.
Exactly. The importance of trust, of genuine empathic understanding, is highlighted again and again. And Jacobi makes a useful distinction here. Empathy involves both cognitive understanding, grasping the facts of the person's situation, but also, crucially, a deeper emotional recognition. Feeling with the patient, understanding their subjective world from the inside as much as possible.
Feeling with the...
Yes. The analyst is seen less as an expert diagnosing from above and more as a companion, maybe a guide, accompanying the patient on their journey into the unconscious, providing a safe, reliable, contained space where the patient can dare to confront difficult inner material and maybe experience different, healthier patterns of relating than they might have known before. Carrot Nudo talks about the analyst helping the person face the vertical labyrinth of the psyche.
That brings us to transference and counter-transference, which are key in many therapies, but may be viewed differently here.
Yes, they are central, and Jung had some distinct views. Transference, broadly, is still understood as the patient unconsciously projecting feelings, dynamics, expectations from past relationships, often involving complexes and archetypes like parental figures, the shadow, Anima Animus, onto the analyst.
Okay, and counter-transference.
Counter-transference is the analyst's total reaction, conscious and unconscious, to the patient and their projections. It's everything the patient evokes in the analyst.
Now, how did Jung's view on counter-transference differ from, say, Freud's earlier ideas?
This was a really significant shift, and Papadopoulos and von Franz both pointed out. While early Freudian perspectives sometimes saw countertransference mainly as an interference, a problem stemming from the analyst's own unresolved issues that needed to be eliminated.
Right, the analyst stuff getting in the way.
Jung took a different stance. He saw countertransference not just as a potential problem, but as a vital source of information about the patient. He believed the analyst had to be somewhat vulnerable, subject to influence from the patient's unconscious dynamics, in order to truly understand what was going on. The analyst's reactions, their feelings, their images, their gut responses, these could provide crucial clues to the patient's inner world and the unconscious dynamics at play between them.
So it's not just noise to be filtered out, it's actually a potential tool for understanding the patient more deeply.
Exactly. A crucial diagnostic and relational tool. However, Jung was also very aware of the dangers. He talked about the risk of psychic infection, where the analyst unconsciously identifies with the patient's issues, gets sucked into their complex, and loses objectivity. It's a fine line.
It sounds like a really intense dynamic.
It is. The therapeutic relationship is seen as this incredibly complex, dynamic field. Von Franz even used alchemical metaphors, which Jung loved. She described the dynamic involving four figures always being present: the conscious man and his unconscious anima, interacting with the conscious woman and her unconscious animus. This happens in romantic relationships and in therapy, leading to all sorts of subtle psychic attractions and repulsions.
And as the sources noted, this is probably even more intense now because those Anima Animus projections are landing on human partners and analysts, not distant religious figures.
Precisely, which is why the sources strongly emphasize the need for the therapy relationship to be continent.
Continent, meaning
Well-boundaried, ethically sound, able to hold the powerful emotional and psychic energies that inevitably arise. This includes containing what's often termed the erotic content of the relationship.
And erotic here isn't just about sex, right?
No, not necessarily or exclusively. It encompasses the whole range of relational energy: warmth, trust, intimacy, vitality, connection, longing, idealization, even aggression, all the life force involved in that deep connection. The sources point out that there can be an erotic deficit, a lack of warmth or connection, just as much as an erotic excess in therapy, and both need careful attention and containment.
This all sounds like it requires a huge amount of self-awareness from the analyst.
Absolutely essential. Which brings us to a critical point emphasized repeatedly in the sources. The analyst's own extensive training analysis is non-negotiable. As Jacoby highlights, analysts absolutely must have worked through their own complexes, their own histories, particularly around things like shame and relational wounds, to be aware of their potential counter-transference triggers. Otherwise, they risk unconsciously acting out their own stuff and distorting the patient's process.
So putting it all together, Jungian therapy today sounds like this deep, long-term, highly relational process focused on individuation, getting people to consciously engage with their unconscious using dreams, imagination, amplification, all happening within this carefully held therapeutic relationship where transference and countertransference are key parts of the work, and the analyst has done a lot of their own inner work.
That's a really good summary. It's definitely a therapy focused on depth, on the relationship itself, and on supporting that lifelong journey towards becoming a more whole, conscious, integrated individual.
Okay. So thinking about all these powerful concepts, archetypes, complexes, individuation, the therapy itself, it's clear these weren't just abstract theories for Jung's time. They offer really useful lenses for understanding our modern world too, right?
Absolutely. Their relevance is ongoing.
Let's explore that, starting with relationships. We touched on this with Anima Animus.
Yes. Those concepts alone provide such a valuable insight into why we're drawn to certain people, why conflicts flare up, why communication breaks down. Understanding that those intense initial attractions, or maybe those later deep irritations, might be fueled by unconscious projections of our own inner feminine or masculine figures. That can totally change how we see things. It helps make sense of the classic war of the sexes dynamics.
And the impact of those early family archetypes and complexes, we talked about the mother, the father, they definitely play out in our adult relationships, our attachments, our closest bonds.
Hugely. Jacoby, especially when discussing shame and drawing on infant research, highlights how fundamental relational issues like trust and shame are absolutely critical for understanding difficulties in connection.
Shame, really.
Yes. If your early experiences with caregivers involve, say, repeated traumatic shaming or just a lack of reliable emotional attunement, you might develop what she calls a shame resistance. It's like building this unconscious protective wall around yourself.
To avoid feeling that shame again.
Exactly. But that wall, while protective, also prevents genuine vulnerability, openness, intimacy in later relationships. It creates this vicious cycle that really hinders deep connection. Jungian concepts help us understand the deep roots of these kinds of painful relational patterns.
That makes a lot of sense. Jung's work also touched on the mind-body connection, didn't it? Which is a huge topic now.
Yes, the sources definitely explore this psychosomatic connection, how our psychological states, chronic stress, anxiety, depression, trauma, can have very real, tangible impacts on our physical health.
Is it simple cause and effect?
Well, contemporary research shows it's complex, nuanced, not always a simple A causes B. But the Jungian perspective inherently holds that the psyche and the body are not separate entities. Ramos, for instance, talks about the psyche of the body and mentions this idea of inherent self-healing structures. It suggests the psyche has its own wisdom and capacity for physical repair, not just psychological balancing. It aligns with that compensatory function we see in dreams, but potentially operating on a physical level too.
So our inner state isn't just in our head, it's deeply woven into our physical being. Interesting. Jungian ideas can even shed light on group dynamics. How does that work?
The sources, like Boyd's work on transformation in groups, discuss how Jungian archetypes can actually manifest and drive what happens within small groups. They introduce this idea of a focal person.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, someone within the group who, often quite unconsciously, starts to embody the collective unconscious concerns, anxieties, or complexes of the entire group. This person can become a kind of lightning rod or a catalyst for change.
So the group's unspoken stuff, its archetypal tensions, get kind of projected onto or played out through one individual.
Precisely. This focal person might suddenly challenge the group's norms, or express uncomfortable truths everyone else is avoiding, or embody some kind of archetypal paradox, maybe related to the great mother, or the father, or the hero. And by doing so, they force the group to confront its own underlying dynamics, its own shadow perhaps, and potentially move towards a new level of functioning or transformation.
Fascinating. And maybe the most visible place we see Jungian concepts still alive and kicking is in our culture, myths, and media.
Oh, absolutely. This is where those archetypes we talked about earlier really come alive in forms everyone recognizes, even if they don't know the Jungian terms. We can use these ideas as a powerful lens to analyze the underlying patterns, the recurring themes, the character dynamics in our stories, our films, our books, our art.
The hero's journey.
The hero's journey, definitely. The appearance of the shadow figure in villains or anti-heroes. The quest for the treasure, whether it's literal gold or wholeness or knowledge or love, the struggle with inner opposites, it's all there.
The sources specifically mention analyzing superhero films like Superman and Batman through this lens.
Yes, Iachino's analysis uses these as modern myths. Characters like Superman grappling with his immense power, needing to sort of shed it temporarily to connect with his humanity.
Right, becoming Clark Kent.
Or Batman, wrestling with his dark, masked persona, his methods that skirt the law, his moral compromises. These are seen as embodying that archetypal struggle with the divided self. The tension between the conscious persona and the powerful, sometimes dangerous, unconscious shadow. They're modern versions of the hero grappling with his own darkness on the path towards some kind of integration.
And it's not just pop culture, right? The sources also mention using this approach to analyze works by highbrow artists and writers, Joyce, Picasso.
Yes, to understand the unconscious processes potentially at work in creative genius. It's about recognizing that these deep, universal patterns of the psyche are constantly seeking expression, whether it's in ancient myths scribbled on cave walls, or in the dreams of someone in therapy today, or in the latest blockbuster movie, or a challenging piece of modern art. Jungian psychology gives us a language to understand that deep cultural resonance.
Okay, one more concept to revisit in the modern world. Synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence idea.
Ah, yes, synchronicity. Jung's concept, discussed by Papadopoulos and von Franz, about a causal orderedness.
A causal orderedness.
Meaning events that are connected not by cause and effect, not A happens because of B, but connected by their meaning or significance for the person experiencing them. They seem to point to some deeper underlying order in reality that isn't just physical causality.
So like two things happen around the same time. They aren't directly linked by cause, but the convergence feels really significant to you.
Exactly. The classic example Jung used was thinking intently about a specific, unusual scarab beetle from a patient's dream, and at that very moment, a real scarab-like beetle taps on his window. There's no causal link between the inner thought dream image and the outer event, but the timing and symbolism make the coincidence incredibly meaningful for the therapy process.
Or thinking of someone you haven't heard from in ages, and then the phone rings and it's them.
That's a common one, people report. No physical cause effect, but the timing feels deeply significant. The sources note that while you can't predict or rely on these things, these just-so correspondences can definitely manifest in clinical work. Sometimes they feel like powerful indicators that something important is shifting, some new psychological process is emerging, or they act as motivational spurs, helping organize experiences into new, meaningful patterns. Jung saw it as related to other phenomena that defy simple causality, like the inherent patterns in numbers or quantum unpredictability suggesting forms of order in the universe that aren't just linear cause and effect.
It definitely adds a layer of mystery, maybe even magic, to how our inner world might connect with the outer world.
Okay, so looking at all this, Jung's legacy is huge. How has the actual practice of Jungian analysis continued to evolve since his time?
Well, it has a rich history. Jung himself was influenced early on by people like Eugen Bleuler, Pierre Genet, Theodore Flournoy. And of course, he had that intense, complicated, ultimately diverging relationship with Freud.
Right.
And then early Jungian training centers started popping up, mainly in Zurich, which is the original hub, but also London, San Francisco, other places. And each center developed slightly different emphases, different training styles, which contributes to the diversity you still see within the Jungian world today.
There have been significant shifts or new developments since Jung passed away. Oh, definitely. Post-Jungian analysts, the generations that followed, have really dug into issues like transference and counter-transference and especially clinical ethics much more explicitly and thoroughly than Jung himself often did in his published writings. They've built a more robust, detailed framework for practice, as Papadopoulos notes.
Okay, what else?
A really crucial development has been the integration of contemporary developmental perspectives, especially the groundbreaking infant research done by people like Daniel Stern.
How did that affect things?
Well, Stern's work, which Jacoby discusses, really challenged some earlier psychoanalytic and even Jungian ideas about the very beginning of life. The idea that infants start in a state of complete fusion or undifferentiation with the caregiver. Stern's observations suggested that infants actually have a nascent sense of self and can distinguish themselves from others much earlier than previously thought.
So modern research on babies is refining how Jungian ideas about early development are understood.
Yes, exactly. And this research strongly supports the increased focus you see in contemporary Jungian practice on the relational aspects of therapy. The vital importance of the moment-to-moment interaction, the emotional exchange, the mutual recognition between analyst and patient.
building on Stern's ideas like affect attunement.
Precisely. Things like affect attunement, moments of meeting, the need for recognition, these are seen as vital components of healthy development and therapeutic change. So, Jungian analysis today puts even greater emphasis on that. It's seen as absolutely central to the transformative process, drawing on work from many contemporary figures like Cambray, Jacobi, Papadopoulos, and others who emphasize the relational dimension.
Interesting. Now, Jung himself, the sources mentioned a kind of tension sometimes in his therapeutic style, sometimes quite direct, almost Gnostic, telling people what things meant, versus a more open-ended, Socratic questioning approach.
Yes, Papadopoulos brings up that tension. Apparently, especially in his letters, Jung could be quite prescriptive sometimes. Your dream means this, or you should do that.
Right.
Contemporary practice, generally speaking, tends to lean much more strongly towards the Socratic end of that spectrum, emphasizing openness, curiosity, collaboration, seeing the analyst more as a facilitator, or maybe a midwife, helping the patient discover their own meaning rather than being the expert with all the answers.
But people still want answers sometimes.
They do. And that's the ongoing navigation for the analyst. Balancing that facilitation with the human need for understanding, containment, and sometimes direction, analysts need to be really aware of their own stance and how it impacts the patient. But it's important to remember, Jung fundamentally saw himself as an empiricist. He grounded his theories in careful observation of psychological reality. And that empirical spirit, that respect for the phenomena of the psyche itself, remains foundational.
Okay. So if we try to draw all these threads together, the core concepts, individuation, the therapy methods, the modern relevance, the ongoing evolution, what is Jungian therapy like today, in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, Jungian therapy today is a form of depth psychology. It's deeply rooted in Jung's original, incredibly rich framework, but it's also very much alive and evolving. It's informed by decades of clinical experience and dialogue with relevant contemporary research, especially around relational dynamics and human development. It remains fundamentally a process-oriented therapy, focused on facilitating individuation, that journey towards integrating the conscious and unconscious, towards greater wholeness.
How does it work in practice?
It involves working deeply with the unconscious. Using those methods we discussed, dream analysis, amplification, active imagination, maybe Sandplay or other creative modalities, all happening within the crucial context of a contained, empathic, and ethically grounded therapeutic relationship. It pays close attention to archetypal patterns, complexes, transference, and counter-transference dynamics. And there's a strong contemporary emphasis on the relational field, the here-and-now interaction. It's generally not a quick fix, but rather a profound, often long-term journey towards deeper self-awareness, integration, healing, and ultimately realizing more of your unique potential.
Wow. We have certainly covered an immense amount of ground today. From Jung's revolutionary map of the psyche, the conscious, the personal and collective unconscious, through those powerful archetypes and the disruptive energy of complexes.
Then the whole challenging but ultimately rewarding journey of individuation towards wholeness, towards the self.
Right. And then looking at how Jungian therapy puts these profound ideas into practice and how relevant they still feel for understanding ourselves, our relationships, our culture, even those strange coincidences.
Jung's work really does provide an incredibly rich, nuanced, and I think enduring framework for understanding the sheer complexity of the human psyche, those deep patterns that connect us all, and that fundamental, often unconscious, drive towards meaning and integration that seems to be at the heart of human life. It continues to offer such valuable insights for navigating both our inner worlds and our outer lives.
It definitely leaves us with a lot to think about. Building on that idea of synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences that hint at an order beyond just cause and effect. What might we be missing if we only look for causal explanations in life? How much of the meaning, the order, the connection we experience might actually relate to some deeper, a causal pattern, something linked to the psyche itself, just waiting for us to notice?
That's a great question. And maybe expanding on the self, that archetype of wholeness, and the related idea that each of us has some unique gift to bring. How might paying more intentional attention to our inner world, our dreams, our recurring images, our emotional knots, our complexes, how might that reveal not just our struggles, but also point towards that specific, unique contribution we're perhaps meant to offer the world?
Profound questions indeed. Definitely something to carry with you, to mull over from this deep dive. We really appreciate you joining us on this exploration of Carl Jung's fascinating universe.